Hey everybody, it's Drew from 198 Methods. Wanted to record a quick video about some recent developments on our campaign to get ICE out of our communities and climate negotiations, because there was some big news in the Senate last week, which you might have missed with the sudden departure for a long Memorial Day recess. So first thing to back up and remember is how this all started. You can see behind me some headlines from very early this year. There was a surge of ICE agents into Minneapolis and the Twin Cities area in Minnesota, and that resulted in the murder of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, as well as the abduction of thousands of residents of the Twin Cities, including that little boy Liam in the bunny hat, and all kinds of bad things that happened as a part of that. In response to that happening, the Democrats, especially Democrats in the U.S. Senate, in the Congress, decided to blockade all new spending on ICE and Customs and Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, the two big agencies that were responsible for the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and who had done a lot of the violence in the Twin Cities and previously had been involved in a lot of violence in Los Angeles and Chicago and in dozens of other communities around the U.S. So, starting in about February, Democrats in the U.S. Senate said they would not approve any new spending for ICE and CBP unless and until there were major reforms in how those agencies operated. Those demands included, amongst other things, not allowing ICE agents to wear masks while they did their job and not allowing them to operate without warrants that were signed by a judge. Those were two big offenses that had led to a lot of the escalation in the Twin Cities. And so Democrats in the Congress said they wouldn't vote for any new spending for those agencies unless there were these big reforms. That shutdown of the entire Department of Homeland Security was one of the longest in history, lasted about 76 days. You may remember in February and March, there were these problems with TSA agents not getting paid. There were questions about whether FEMA would have money to operate because those TSA and FEMA are two other departments that operate as part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's kind of the overarching agency. And then FEMA and TSA and ICE and CBP are all sort of sub departments of the Department of Homeland Security. So, right at the end of April, early May, Democrats finally approved funding for the rest of the Department of Homeland Security. So that's when the TSA agents started getting paid. We had funds for FEMA, for the Coast Guard, for all kinds of other things, but still not for ICE and CBP. They did not approve any new money for ICE and CBP because, again, there hadn't been any reforms to those particular agencies. This is where it's really important to remember why we don't comply in advance. It would have been very easy for Democrats in the US Congress to say, well, we're going to fund the rest of DHS. Why don't we just give ICE and CBP the money to operate as well? Maybe we'll do it for a couple of weeks or just for a month or two, place some sort of constraints on the timing of the funding. But Democrats stuck to their guns and they said, no, until there are major reforms at these agencies and how they operate, we won't approve any new funding for those agencies. And they got it done. They were able to pass a spending bill which funded other parts of the Department of Homeland Security, but not ICE and CBP. Last week, we told you right before Memorial Day, the Senate was getting very close to voting on a package of $70 billion of funding, really just for ICE and the Border Patrol or CBP, the parts that had been left out of those previous funding bills in early May. It looked like they had the votes to do it because they were passing it through a process called budget reconciliation, which means that they only needed Republican votes to pass the bill. They could do it on a party line vote with 51 senators being enough. But we also told you last week, right before Memorial Day, that there were some cracks developing in the Republican coalition. In particular, two things had come up at that point early in the week before Memorial Day. One is that people were getting mad about the funding in the bill, which was for Trump's big ballroom. And second was that because Trump had been attacking a number of sitting members of Congress and backing their opponents in primary challenges, including in Texas and in Louisiana and in other states, there was some reason to think or hope that some of those Republican senators might vote against some of these spending priorities from the White House because they weren't supported by voters in their district. So we had you call and email and contact your senators last week to tell them to vote no on this budget spending. And we got a big break midway through the week for the first time ever since the war with Iran started. We were able to pass a war powers resolution constraining the Trump administration's ability to spend money on the war in Iran. And we were able to do that because one senator from Louisiana flipped his vote after he lost his primary to a Trump endorsed challenger. That was a good sign that Trump going all in attacking members of his own party was going to backfire on him during times like these budget bills. And that's what led to the big news late last week. The Senate and the House both decided to just give up and go home for recess before Memorial Day and not vote on the budget reconciliation package, including the $70 billion for ICE and CBP. The reason that senators gave for why they left town early without finishing negotiations or voting on the bill was they said they had problems with this new proposal from the Trump administration to create a $1.8 billion slush fund. We're calling it a slush fund for fossil fueled fascists, but it's basically a huge amount of money paid for by taxpayers like us, but that would be given by the Trump administration to whoever they think deserves it. And in particular, they had named, for example, people who had been prosecuted as for attacking the Capitol on January 6, 2021, people who had been targeted by the Biden administration's Department of Justice for things like fraud or hiding White House documents. Those kind of things were who they were looking to give this money and settlement fund to. That annoyed and frightened enough Republicans that they would get caught voting to approve billions of dollars of funding for agencies that were responsible for employing or giving out some of this $1.8 billion slush fund. That stalled the vote. Doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. Congress will be back in a few weeks, and we do expect them to take back up the question of this ICE and CBP funding bill when they get there. Whether or not they will have the votes and whether or not they will be able to pass it, regardless of this $1.8 billion slush fund for fossil fuel fascism or not, depends on what we do over the next couple of weeks. So if you haven't already, great time while they're home on recess. Find your member of Congress, find your senators, tell them that you want them to vote no on any new spending for ICE and CBP, and tell them that you are opposed to the government sponsoring fossil fuel fascism here and abroad, and that you want them to demonstrate that they're with you on that issue by voting for war powers resolutions, constraining the Trump administration's ability to spend money on domestic law enforcement like ICE and CBP, domestic deportation campaigns, and all the things that attack our communities instead of funding action on climate change. So, quick recap of what happened last week. Congratulations to everybody who called and emailed. You won, at least for a little bit. And stay tuned. We'll have more updates for you in the weeks ahead.